9-year-old princesses vanished behind cedar latticework, while their fathers toasted peace. In 12th century Iberia, Christian courts shipped little girls across the straits as living presents for an Almohad sultan whose word meant war or truce. Their names were scrubbed from chronicles, their voices lost in palace corridors, but the graves remain. Tonight we open those screens and count the human cost hidden inside a single diplomatic custom. The year 1147 marked the beginning of a relentless dance of death across the Iberian Peninsula. From the fortress walls of Castile to the minarets of Seville, two civilizations ground against each other like millstones, crushing everything caught between. The Reconquista had become a bloody seesaw. Christian kingdoms of Castile, Leon, Navarre, and Aragon pushing southward with cross-emblazoned banners, while Almohad forces answered from their strongholds stretching from Andalusian Seville to the red walls of Marrakesh. This was no romantic tale of chivalrous knights and noble conquest. The frontier reeked of burned villages and rotting corpses. Continuous raids exhausted royal coffers faster than they could be filled. Peasants fled their fields, leaving harvests to wither, while armies trampled what remained. Gold and silver tribute that once bought temporary peace now seemed as scarce as mercy on the battlefield. Desperate rulers on both sides of the religious divide began seeking breathing room through increasingly desperate measures. When traditional tribute of precious metals ran dry, they turned to a currency that required no mining, no minting, only the heartbreak of selection. Human flesh became the new silver, and children the new gold. Into this maelstrom stepped Sultan Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur, the Almohad ruler whose very name meant the victorious. From his palace in Marrakesh, he commanded an empire that stretched across North Africa and into the heart of Muslim Spain. His word could unleash armies or grant reprieve. Christian monarchs, Alfonso VIII of Castile, Sancho VII of Navarre, Alfonso II of Portugal, learned to court his favor not just with diplomats bearing treaties, but with caravans carrying treasures no honest man should offer. The most precious of these gifts walked on small feet and spoke in voices that would soon be silenced forever. The palace of Marrakesh stood like a jeweled dagger thrust into the heart of the Maghreb. Marble courtyards reflected the shimmer of brass lanterns that cast dancing shadows across intricate geometric patterns carved into cedar and stucco. The scent of orange blossoms mingled with frankincense as turbaned scholars debated fine points of Islamic law in hushed voices, their words echoing off walls inscribed with verses from the Quran. Eunuch guards, their faces masks of practiced indifference, moved silently through corridors where power wore silk robes and spoke in whispers. This was the zenith of Almohad civilization, but beneath its cultured surface lay an ideology as sharp as Damascus steel. The Almohads had risen from the Atlas Mountains as religious reformers, their name meaning those who proclaim the unity of God. Their militant piety brooked no compromise with what they saw as the corrupted Islam of their predecessors. Under their rule, the faithful would be purified, the wavering would be corrected, and the infidel would submit or perish. At the heart of this palace maze lay the harem, the women's quarters known in Arabic as the haram, the forbidden sanctuary. Here, behind screens of carved wood and curtains of Persian silk, an entirely different court held sway. The mother of princes, a woman of advancing years and iron will, ruled this shadowed realm with absolute authority. She had once been young and beautiful herself, perhaps even a gift from some distant kingdom. But time had transformed her into something far more dangerous, a keeper of secrets and maker of kings. Within these perfumed chambers, gift concubines served purposes that transcended mere pleasure. They were living symbols of their kingdom's submission, breathing proof of alliances, sealed not in ink but in flesh. More crucially, they were potential mothers of princes, wombs that might carry the next generation of Almohad rulers. Politics wrapped itself in veils and whispered through latticed windows where young girls learned that their bodies were battlefields, and their children would be weapons in wars they would never understand. The Sultan himself moved through this world like a shadow, appearing only for ceremonial presentations when new gifts arrived, his presence both blessing and curse for those who knelt before him in silk robes too large for their small frames. The disaster at Alarcos in 1195 had left Christian Iberia reeling. Alfonso VIII of Castile watched his knights fall like wheat before the scythe of Almohad cavalry, their banners trampled into the red earth of Extremadura. The flower of Castilian nobility lay rotting under the southern sun, and with them died any illusion that Christian arms alone could hold back the tide of Muslim conquest. In his darkest hour, the proud king who had once dreamed of pushing the cross to Gibraltar now found himself drafting letters of submission to the very sultan who had orchestrated his humiliation. The parchment that sealed Castile's fragile peace bore elegant Latin script, but the ink might as well have been blood. Alfonso's scribes employed the flowery language of medieval diplomacy, yet beneath the ornate phrases lay a transaction that would have made slave traders blush. The king offered yearly tribute of gold and silver, yes, but also something far more precious, children of royal blood to serve as hostages of honor in the sultan's court. Word of Castile's desperate bargains spread through the Christian kingdoms like wildfire. Embassy after embassy made the humiliating journey to Marrakesh, each bearing similar offers wrapped in increasingly desperate euphemisms. Sancho VII of Navarre dispatched his most trusted counselors with charters that praised the obedience of infants barely old enough to walk. Alfonso II of Portugal authorized agreements that promised yearly tribute should these child gifts bear heirs to the Almohad throne, a clause that revealed the true nature of their fate with sickening clarity. The Church, keeper of Christendom's moral conscience, found itself caught between doctrine and survival. Canon law explicitly forbade the surrender of Christian children to Muslim courts, yet the alternative was conquest and the complete extinction of Christian rule in Iberia. Bishops who should have thundered condemnation from their pulpits instead offered quiet counsel about the greater good. Confessors who should have refused absolution instead whispered about necessary sacrifices. The protests of religious authorities grew muted as the reality of military weakness became undeniable. Better to compromise with sin than surrender to annihilation. The selection process began in the shadowed chambers of Christian courts, where matrons with practiced eyes examined genealogical charts like merchants appraising precious stones. Only legitimate daughters qualified for this terrible honor. Bastards, however beautiful, carried insufficient political weight. The girls chosen bore not just royal blood, but also the cruel mathematics of diplomacy, young enough to be molded, old enough to survive the journey, and blessed with the kind of unmarred beauty that would reflect well upon their father's kingdoms. Court confessors wrestled with calculations that would have made Judas weep. They measured sin against survival, weighing the damnation of individual souls against the preservation of Christian realms. In hushed conversations behind cathedral pillars, these men of God convinced themselves that sacrifice of the few might save the many. Their theological gymnastics could not mask the fundamental truth. They were trading children's lives for time. The chosen girls underwent a grotesque preparation for their fate. Palace tutors drilled them in the elaborate courtesies of medieval nobility, teaching them to curtsy with perfect grace while their childhood died in increments. Arabic instructors arrived from Toledo and Cordoba, men who had served Muslim courts and understood the language their charges would need in their new prison. During the long journey south, these girls practiced pronunciation of words that would soon become their only means of survival. The departure itself was cloaked in the fiction of pilgrimage. Departure ceremonies spoke of journeys to holy sites, of prayers to be offered for the kingdom's welfare. But the cedar chests loaded onto pack mules told a different story, They contained trousseaux, sewn for bodies that had not yet grown into them, wedding gowns for brides who still played with dolls when no one was watching. We know of one such case, recorded in the fragments of a chronicle from Extremadura. An infanta, daughter of a minor lord desperate to curry favor with his king, was selected at age 9 for this honor. The document notes her exceeding beauty and quick wit, but fails to record her name. Even in the moment of her selection, the process of erasure had begun. The roads to Algeciras wound through hills that had witnessed 1,000 farewells, their dusty paths lit by the wavering flames of torches carried by armed escorts. Mule trains descended toward the Mediterranean under starlit skies, their bells creating a funeral dirge that echoed off limestone cliffs. In the darkness, the small figures wrapped in traveling cloaks seemed more like phantoms than children, their faces pale crescents in the flickering light. The perfumed cedar chests that swayed with each step of the pack animals contained more than mere clothing. They held the remnants of childhoods that would never be completed. Silk gowns hung like empty promises, their sleeves too long for arms that might never grow to fill them. Pearl necklaces lay coiled like serpents, waiting to adorn throats that might never speak their native tongues again. Wedding veils, gossamer thin and impossibly delicate, awaited heads that still bore the soft curves of infancy. At Algeciras, the final Christian port before the crossing, guarded barges waited in the harbor like floating tombs. The vessels that would carry these living tributes across the Strait of Gibraltar had been specially fitted with cabins draped in silk, their windows shuttered against curious eyes. Shipboard chaplains offered final blessings and general absolution, their voices trembling as they spoke words of comfort they themselves did not believe. The chaplain's authority ended at the water's edge. Once these children stepped aboard, they passed beyond the reach of Christian law, Christian protection, Christian memory. The priests who had baptized them heard their first confessions, and blessed their innocent games, now relinquished all claim to their souls. The barges pushed off from Spanish soil with their precious cargo, leaving behind the last men who would ever call these girls by their Christian names. As the African coast drew near, the call to prayer echoed across the water from Tangiers minarets. The last glimpse of Europe faded into morning mist, and with it disappeared the final threads connecting these children to the world that had shaped them. Ahead lay gates that would close behind them forever, and lives that would unfold in languages they were only beginning to understand. Dawn in the harem arrived with the haunting call of the muezzin, echoing from Marrakesh's towering minaret. The girls who had once awakened to church bells now stirred to the melodic cadences of Arabic prayers, their small bodies rising from silk cushions in chambers where sunlight filtered through intricate mashrabia screens. The ritual ablutions that followed were supervised by older women, Andalusian converts who had walked this same path decades earlier and now served as both guides and guards for the newest arrivals. The daily routine began with Quranic lessons, young voices struggling to pronounce sacred verses in a language that still felt foreign on their tongues. Patient tutors, eunuchs selected for their scholarly learning, corrected pronunciation with gentle persistence. These men understood that survival in the Sultan's court depended not just on beauty, but on the ability to navigate the complex religious and cultural currents that governed palace life. Afternoons brought embroidery circles where needle and thread became tools of transformation. Under the watchful eyes of the mother of princes, small fingers learned to create geometric patterns that mirrored the palace's architectural splendor. The designs they stitched carried symbolic weight, each motif a prayer, each color a statement of faith. As they worked, the girls heard whispered stories of those who had come before, tales that served as both comfort and warning. Strict segregation governed every aspect of their existence. The Sultan himself remained a distant figure, glimpsed only during ceremonial gift presentations when new arrivals knelt before his throne in silk robes that pooled around their feet like liquid moonlight. These brief encounters, conducted in the presence of court officials and religious scholars, represented the only moments when the invisible walls of the harem became permeable. The luxury surrounding them was undeniable. Pomegranates from palace gardens, rose water from Persian distilleries, fabrics that shimmered like captured starlight. Yet beneath this opulence lay a crushing weight of confinement. Gardens visible through latticed windows remained forever out of reach. Voices from the men's courts carried on evening breezes, speaking of a world these girls would never again inhabit. By their 12th year, some entered what court euphemisms call the inner chamber. Here, in rooms heavy with sandalwood incense and the whispered expectations of dynasties, childhood's final moments flickered and died. Motherhood began not with joy, but with the terrible mathematics of empire. Each pregnancy, a potential prince, each birth, a roll of history's dice. Their Christian names, once spoken with parental love, faded into memory like winter snow. The palace bestowed new titles that defined them solely by their origins. Al-Castilla for the Castilian, Al-Garnatia for the Granadan, Al-Burtucalia for the Portuguese. They became living maps of their fathers' defeats, their very existence, proof of submission, written in flesh and blood. The poetry that flowed from Almohad court scribes dripped with honeyed metaphors that would have made Abbasid caliphs weep with envy. These panegyrics, written in elegant Arabic script on parchment perfumed with ambergris, celebrated the Sultan's rain-bringing brides, whose beauty was said to rival the houris of paradise. The verses spoke of pearls from the northern seas and roses transplanted from Christian gardens, their flowery language masking the brutal reality with layers of literary artifice. From the Christian chancelleries came equally elaborate deceptions, their Latin phrases polished to a diplomatic shine that reflected nothing of the anguish behind them. Royal scribes crafted careful sentences noting how our beloved daughter prospers in obedience to her new lord, while careful omissions revealed what no Christian king dared acknowledge openly. These letters praise the girls' adaptation to foreign customs and their fulfillment of dynastic obligations, euphemisms that crumbled like ash when examined too closely. The silence was what spoke loudest of all. In the vast archives of both Christian and Muslim courts, no first-person letters survive from the girls themselves, no plaintive appeals for rescue, no descriptions of their daily lives, no final farewells to families they would never see again. This absence was not accidental, it was policy, a systematic erasure that began the moment they crossed the threshold into the harem and continued until their names vanished from historical record entirely. Comparing the surviving chancery documents reveals a careful choreography of mutual deception. Christian scribes emphasized the honor bestowed upon their kingdoms through these marriages, while Muslim court poets celebrated the voluntary submission of northern princesses to the true faith. Both sides collaborated in maintaining fictions that allowed each to claim moral victory while participating in transactions that medieval law, both canonical and Islamic, should have forbidden. The most telling detail lay not in what these documents proclaimed, but in what they consistently avoided. Never did Christian chronicles mention ages at departure. Never did Muslim poets describe the tears of arrival. The bureaucratic language of diplomacy had devoured the human reality, leaving only dry phrases about political arrangements and dynastic necessities, where once there had been children's laughter. The red earth of Morocco keeps its secrets reluctantly, but modern archaeologists have learned to read the stories written in bone and stone. Near the ancient Almohad stronghold of Tinmel, where the Atlas Mountains cradle the dynasty's spiritual birthplace, excavations have uncovered graves that speak with voices the chroniclers silenced. The skeletal remains of adolescent females, their bones bearing the unmistakable chemical signatures of Iberian childhood, lie beneath unmarked stones in a necropolis that time forgot. Isotope analysis of tooth enamel reveals the truth that no diplomat would record. These young women had drunk the waters of Christian Spain, breathed the air of Castilian highlands, consumed the grains that grew in Portuguese soil. Their bones carried the geographic fingerprints of their birthlands, like accusations written in calcium and phosphate. Yet here they lay, thousands of miles from the churches where they were baptized, buried according to customs they learned only in their final years. The funerary slabs that marked their resting places followed a pattern as deliberate as it was heartbreaking. No inscriptions identified the dead by name or lineage. Islamic law forbade such honors for those who had not been born into the faith. Instead, only floral motifs decorated the stones, geometric patterns that mimicked the embroidery these girls had learned in palace workshops. Even in death, they remained anonymous, their identities subsumed into the artistic vocabulary of their captors. Osteological examination reveals stories that no court poet would have dared to record. Stress marks on growing bones testified to nutritional deficiencies, the rickets of children forced to adapt to foreign diets and confined spaces. The pelvic bones of several skeletons showed clear evidence of pregnancies that began when their owners were barely adolescents themselves. Some bore the telltale signs of puerperal fever, the childbed infection that claimed so many medieval mothers, especially those weakened by youth and displacement. The most haunting discovery came from careful analysis of growth patterns in the bones themselves. Forensic anthropologists could piece together ages at death with disturbing precision. Some of these young women had died at 14, others at 15, their bodies giving out under the double burden of premature motherhood and profound cultural dislocation. Their graves, clustered in a section of the necropolis reserved for palace residents, formed a silent chorus of testimony that chroniclers on both sides of the religious divide had conspired to silence. The ledgers of medieval diplomacy recorded temporary truces, like merchants tallying seasonal profits, but the arithmetic of child-bride diplomacy proved as unstable as the alliances it was meant to secure. The peace purchased at Alarcos, with promises of royal daughters, lasted barely a decade before the wheel of war turned once more. At Las Navas de Tolosa, in 1212, the very ground that had witnessed Christian defeat 17 years earlier became the stage for Almohad collapse, as Alfonso VIII led a coalition that shattered Muslim power in Iberia like glass against stone. The Christian kingdoms that had once groveled for mercy now pressed their advantage with the fury of the humiliated. Castile, Leon, Aragon, and their allies swept southward in a tide of steel and righteous anger, reclaiming territories that had been lost for generations. The Almohad Empire, stretched thin across 2 continents and weakened by internal divisions, began to fracture like a clay pot left too long in the kiln. The irony was as bitter as wormwood. The very children who had been sacrificed to buy time for Christian recovery now watched helplessly as their birth kingdoms destroyed the empire their bodies had helped to preserve. The girls who had borne Almohad princes found themselves mothers of dynasties that would never rule, their sons caught between 2 worlds that were tearing each other apart with renewed savagery. The truces that their fathers had purchased with their daughters' lives proved as ephemeral as morning mist. The seasons of peace they had bought, spring plantings unburned, summer harvests ungathered by armies, autumn festivals unclouded by the smoke of war, collapsed into the familiar rhythm of raid and counter-raid that had defined the peninsula for centuries. Both sides returned to their swords with a vengeance that suggested the diplomatic interlude had been merely a pause to sharpen blades. In the victory chronicles that celebrated Christian triumph at Las Navas, the girls who had once been offered as living tribute disappeared entirely from the narrative. Their fates went unmentioned in the songs of victory, their names absent from the lists of prisoners freed or ransomed. They had served their purpose as disposable currency in a transaction that purchased nothing lasting, and now they were forgotten as completely as if they had never existed at all. The genealogical charts that medieval scribes lovingly maintained reveal the careful architecture of selective memory. Royal sons received elaborate family trees, their lineages traced back through generations of kings and queens, their births celebrated with detailed horoscopes cast by court astrologers. Yet beside these flourishing branches lay blank spaces, empty lines where daughters' names should have appeared, the places reserved for those who had become presents rather than people. Chroniclers on both sides of the religious divide participated in this institutionalized forgetting with the dedication of professional amnesiacs. Christian histories prioritize the glorious deeds of crusading kings while glossing over the transactions that had made those deeds possible. Muslim court historians celebrated the piety and wisdom of their sultans while reducing the human cost of diplomacy to flowery metaphors about gardens of submission and flowers of the north. The silence was so complete that modern historians have been forced to become archaeological detectives, piecing together fragments of lives from the margins of official documents. A stray clause in a treaty here, a casual reference in a merchant's letter there, an unexpected isotope signature in a forgotten grave. These scattered clues form the only testimony to experiences that medieval society conspired to erase. This deliberate amnesia served the same masters it had always served, those who wielded power over the powerless. Kings who had traded their daughters' childhoods for military breathing room needed those transactions to disappear from historical memory. Sultans who had accepted children as tribute required their courts to forget the ages and origins of the mothers who bore their sons. The machinery of official forgetting ground on with the efficiency of a water wheel, turning human tragedy into political convenience. Yet memory, like water, finds ways to seep through even the most carefully constructed barriers. The graves that archaeologists uncover speak with voices that medieval chroniclers tried to silence. The chemical signatures in ancient bones carry testimony that no royal decree could alter. The gaps in genealogical records become accusations as powerful as any written testimony. In the end, the appetite of power devours the powerless with the same mechanical efficiency in every age. The names change, the weapons evolve, the justifications grow more sophisticated, but the fundamental transaction remains constant. The strong sacrifice the weak on the altar of their own ambitions. The final battlefield is not the clash of armies, but the war over memory itself, where the victors write the histories, and the victims become footnotes in someone else's story.